It began quietly, the way most neighborhood disputes do. At first, it was nothing more than a few murmurs at the monthly HOA meeting, whispers carried between manicured hedges and pointed glances across identical driveways. Yet beneath the neatly trimmed grass and polished mailboxes of Maplewood Estates, something small and furry was about to ignite a storm that no one could have predicted. The community had rules, pages upon pages of them, crafted in stiff formal language that dictated everything from the shade of beige paint permitted on garage doors to the precise height of acceptable mailbox posts. Within those rigid pages, one rule stood out among the rest. Pets must not constitute a nuisance to the peace and character of the community. It was vague, intentionally so, a catch-all phrase meant to give the HOA sweeping authority over anything it deemed unacceptable. And it was that rule which became the weapon pointed at one family's golden retriever named Max. Max was not an ordinary dog. He was, by all accounts, cheerful and energetic, bounding across the backyard with a joy so unfiltered it radiated outward like sunlight. His bark, deep and strong, carried across fences. His tail wagged with such vigor that it knocked over flower pots and sent garden gnomes tumbling. To his owner, he was nothing but loyal companionship, a guardian of the home and a symbol of happiness after years of hard work. But to a handful of neighbors, Max was simply too much. The first complaint was framed as concern. Someone mentioned that the dog barked too loudly at delivery trucks. Another hinted that he startled children when he leapt against the fence, tongue lolling, eyes wide with excitement. Soon the minor inconveniences took root in the minds of the HOA board. And as often happens in tightly wound suburban enclaves, those inconveniences were inflated into scandal. By the second week of spring, an official notice appeared in the homeowner's mailbox. The letter was sharp, concise, and cold. It declared that Max was a nuisance, his presence a violation of the peace and order of Maplewood Estates. It cited Rule 14C of the bylaws and demanded immediate corrective measures. Failure to comply, the notice warned, would result in escalating fines. The owner was stunned. To them, Max was not a nuisance but a family member. Yet the HOA did not see companionship or loyalty. It saw disorder, disruption, and defiance of its carefully manicured world. A fine of $100 was attached to the notice. What began as irritation soon became obsession. The board, led by its president, a woman with a reputation for ironclad enforcement of even the most trivial rules, launched a full investigation. Board members prowled past the house, clipboards in hand, recording the times Max barked, noting the volume of his voice. Neighbors were encouraged to document disturbances, leading to a stream of embellished complaints. A single bark became a disturbance lasting minutes. A playful dash along the fence became aggressive lunging. Soon, a second fine arrived, then a third. The amounts climbed steadily upward, a financial weight meant to force compliance. The owner tried to reason, tried to demonstrate that Max was harmless, but the HOA's grip tightened. By early summer, Max was officially labeled a menace within the pristine boundaries of Maplewood Estates, and it was then, just as the weight of the HOA's demands pressed hardest, that something entirely unexpected happened. It started with a teenager down the street, someone who saw Max not as a nuisance but as entertainment. One afternoon, while Max bounded back and forth in the yard, barking joyfully at a bouncing ball, the teenager pulled out their phone. They recorded Max's playful antics, the exaggerated leaps, the uncontainable energy. Then, with the speed of modern life, the video was uploaded to TikTok with a humorous caption and a catchy song. Within hours, the video began to spread. The neon energy of Max's personality, the way he threw his entire being into each jump and bark, resonated with viewers far beyond Maplewood Estates. The algorithm caught hold, and soon thousands, then hundreds of thousands were watching. Max had gone viral. The first video was followed by more. Neighbors who sympathized with the family began recording Max too, capturing his goofy expressions, his unrelenting enthusiasm, his sheer joy at existing. Each clip added fuel to the fire of his rising fame. Before long, Max had his own dedicated TikTok account. Followers flooded in, drawn to the infectious positivity of a dog who, despite being labeled a nuisance, radiated happiness in every frame. But fame is a double-edged sword, and what delighted the internet infuriated the HOA. The board, already frustrated at what they perceived as defiance, now found themselves mocked online. Clips of Max's nuisance behavior were repurposed into comedy, edited with bright captions and sound effects that painted the HOA's rules as absurd. The more the board complained, the more content appeared. Each letter slipped into the homeowner's mailbox became another viral post. Each fine became a badge of honor, proof of the absurdity of the situation. The HOA meetings turned hostile. The president, red-faced and indignant, declared that the family was deliberately undermining community order. Yet outside the narrow walls of Maplewood Estates, the world was cheering. Strangers left comments praising Max, calling him a hero for standing up to unreasonable authority. Some even began mailing supportive letters and treats to the family's home. By midsummer, the conflict had escalated into something larger than either side anticipated. Max was no longer just a dog in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He was a symbol, an emblem of resistance against overbearing authority. His viral fame had created a wave too large for the HOA to contain, but rather than back down, the board doubled its efforts. Laws were cited. Threats of legal action loomed. Rumors swirled that the HOA might attempt to seize the dog, to remove him from the neighborhood entirely. The tension hung heavy, stretching across backyards and sidewalks, seeping into every whispered conversation between neighbors. Through it all, Max remained blissfully unaware of the storm he had created. To him, life was simple: run, bark, play, love. Yet his joy had become a battlefield, his happiness a rallying cry. The homeowner, once weighed down by fines and letters, began to see something greater forming. What was once a private struggle had become a public story, and the world was watching. And so the stage was set. The HOA believed they had the power to crush dissent with paperwork and penalties. The homeowner believed they had stumbled upon something larger than themselves, a story that resonated far beyond their block. And in the middle of it all, wagging his tail and bounding across the grass, was Max, the dog who refused to be silenced. The battle lines were drawn, and as summer deepened, the conflict was only beginning. Because if the HOA thought fines could stop a viral sensation, they were about to learn just how unstoppable joy could be. The weeks following the first fine were tense in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The Homeowners Association had doubled down on their claims, insisting that the dog was disruptive, barking too often, and attracting unnecessary attention. The fine notices continued, each one carrying a slightly sharper tone, each one feeling less like an administrative warning and more like a deliberate campaign of pressure. What had once been a simple disagreement about one homeowner's pet had escalated into an all-out battle of control, image, and pride. But then, something happened that no board member could have predicted. The dog, previously considered by the HOA to be nothing more than a nuisance, started becoming a local curiosity. People walking their routes in the evening began noticing the dog's unusual habits. The way it would sit perfectly still on the front porch as if standing guard. The way it wagged its tail rhythmically in perfect time with children's jump ropes, and even the way it seemed to perk up whenever a delivery truck approached, almost as though it knew the schedules better than the drivers themselves. These quirks, while charming to passers-by, would have likely remained unnoticed by the wider world, until one teenager with a smartphone decided to film a short clip. The video was simple. It showed the dog sitting patiently by the curb, waiting for the school bus to arrive. As soon as the bus doors swung open, the dog barked once, wagged its tail, and ran excitedly back to the house, as though announcing the child's return. The clip lasted no more than 20 seconds, yet within 24 hours, it was everywhere. On TikTok, the video was shared across feeds, accompanied by captions calling the dog the neighborhood guardian or the smartest pup on the block. The comments flooded in, with people marveling at how loyal and well-trained the dog seemed. By the end of the week, the video had crossed 1 million views, sparking reaction videos, duets, and even compilations of other clever pets. Almost overnight, the narrative had shifted. The HOA had labeled the dog a disturbance, but to the online world, the dog was a star. The newfound fame spilled into real life. Cars began slowing down as they passed the house, with drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the now famous pup. Families from the neighborhood brought their children by on evening walks, hoping to see the viral dog perform its bus stop routine again. Parents posed their kids for photos nearby, and joggers paused to give a quick scratch behind the ears before continuing on their way. The HOA board, however, was less than amused. Each new visitor felt to them like a challenge to their authority, a reminder that the community was slowly slipping out of their control. Their neat, orderly vision of the neighborhood, where houses looked uniform, lawns were maintained with precision, and noise levels were strictly contained, was being overshadowed by a dog that had, without effort, become a beloved local celebrity. As the videos multiplied, so too did the followers. The dog's owner, at first overwhelmed, eventually leaned into the fame. They began uploading short clips showcasing the dog's everyday life, running across the yard, fetching a frisbee with perfect timing, even tilting its head in response to certain words. Each clip drew in more attention, boosting the follower count and spreading the story beyond the neighborhood. News outlets began to notice, and soon small local papers ran headlines like "Local Pup Brings Joy to the Internet." The contrast between the HOA's image and the online narrative could not have been sharper. The HOA insisted the dog was disruptive, but the internet saw it as a hero of wholesomeness. To the board, the dog represented non-compliance, but to the world, it represented joy, loyalty, and community. This clash intensified with each passing day. The HOA began sending more official letters, warning of escalating fines and potential legal consequences. Yet at the same time, the dog's fame was snowballing, reaching audiences far beyond the neighborhood's borders. People who had never heard of the HOA's name were suddenly commenting online about the absurdity of fining such a charming animal. Memes were created, portraying the HOA as villains in dark suits and sunglasses, trying to silence the hero dog. It was a battle of perception, and the HOA was losing. The situation escalated further when local TV reporters arrived with cameras in tow. They wanted to film the dog for a feel-good segment on the evening news, capturing the way it greeted children and delighted neighbors. Residents who had once been indifferent to HOA politics now rallied to the dog's side, eager to be seen in the background, smiling and waving, as though participating in a moment of neighborhood pride. The HOA attempted to push back. They held emergency board meetings, drafted new rules, and even considered legal avenues to curtail the unwanted attention. But each move only seemed to fuel the narrative further. When they posted a sternly worded notice about excessive disturbances caused by pet-related gatherings, screenshots of the notice leaked online, where they were mocked and ridiculed by commenters across social media. The more the HOA fought, the more out of touch they appeared. Meanwhile, the dog's fame continued to grow. Invitations arrived for charity events and pet shows. Influencers with millions of followers requested collaborations. Pet brands reached out with offers of sponsorships, sending free toys, treats, and accessories. The dog, once at risk of being labeled a nuisance, was now bringing in opportunities and financial benefits that the HOA had never anticipated. And yet, despite the joy, tension lingered. The HOA was not willing to back down completely. Their frustrations simmered, visible in the clipped expressions of board members as they walked the streets, their eyes narrowing at the growing crowds near the house. They knew they were being portrayed as the villains in a story that had spiraled beyond their control. But instead of adjusting their stance, they began plotting new strategies to reassert their power. In private, some neighbors worried about what would happen next. Would the HOA attempt harsher measures, perhaps involving lawyers or city authorities? Would they try to target the owner in other ways, such as lawn inspections, parking violations, or mailbox regulations? Or would they escalate to something even more dramatic, risking a full-scale confrontation? The neighborhood had become a stage, and everyone was watching. Cars passing through slowed for a glimpse. Strangers online debated fiercely about property rights versus community joy. Local businesses saw an opportunity and began advertising dog-themed specials, leaning into the viral attention. Even the children at the local school started bragging about living in the neighborhood of the famous dog. For the dog itself, life seemed unchanged. It continued to wag its tail, chase balls, and greet the bus every afternoon with boundless enthusiasm. But for the humans, every wag carried weight. It symbolized defiance, freedom, and the refusal to be silenced. The HOA, determined not to lose control, prepared its next move. And as the neighborhood buzzed with cameras, reporters, and constant online chatter, one thing was certain: the battle was far from over. The dog's fame had only just begun, and the HOA's fight against it was about to enter its most dramatic stage yet. By the time the HOA realized the scale of what had happened, it was already too late. The dog they had labeled as a nuisance was no longer just a neighborhood pet. He had become a symbol, a viral sensation, a source of joy, and most importantly, a rallying point for everyone who was tired of the suffocating weight of HOA rules and the selective enforcement that always seemed to land hardest on ordinary homeowners. The story had spread far beyond the borders of the subdivision. Local news stations were sending reporters with cameras, catching footage of children running across the yard to greet the little dog who had captured hearts online. Cars that didn't belong to residents began slowing down as they passed the neighborhood, passengers pointing toward the now iconic fence where the dog often perched, tail wagging, as if he knew he was the star of the show. The once quiet streets were now alive with activity. Strangers arrived with treats, families stopped on walks to snap photos, and even delivery drivers paused to wave at the dog who had unexpectedly become the area's most famous resident. The yard that had been a supposed problem had become a pilgrimage spot, a place where people felt joy, laughter, and lightness in the middle of their daily grind. Meanwhile, the HOA's leadership was in chaos. The president, who had proudly signed the fine letters just weeks before, was now in damage control mode. Meetings that were once conducted with smug authority turned frantic. The narrative had slipped out of their grasp. Their attempt to label one family and one dog as disruptive had backfired spectacularly, painting the HOA as out-of-touch bullies while elevating the dog into something larger than life. The homeowners of the community began whispering more openly now. For years, many had feared retaliation if they spoke against the board, but seeing the tide turn gave them courage. The dog's fame was like a crack in the armor of the HOA's control, and through that crack poured years of pent-up frustration. Stories began circulating of unnecessary fines, arbitrary enforcement, and the constant feeling of being monitored in their own homes. But while resentment brewed in the background, the dog simply lived his life as he always had, playful, affectionate, and blissfully unaware of the storm around him. To him, nothing had changed. He still greeted every passerby with excitement, still trotted proudly around the yard, still rested his head on the gate to watch children ride bikes down the street. But now, those small acts were celebrated, filmed, and shared with millions. Sponsorship deals trickled in next, something the HOA could neither control nor stop. A popular pet food brand offered to send monthly supplies in exchange for social media posts. A local groomer asked if the dog could appear in their advertisements. Even a city festival extended an invitation for him to serve as a sort of honorary mascot. The family hadn't sought fame, but it arrived at their doorstep anyway, built on the very foundation of the HOA's attempt to shame them. And as the spotlight grew brighter, the HOA's shadow became darker. The president issued statements insisting that their rules were fair and necessary, but the comment section beneath every news article and viral video told a different story. Thousands of voices, from locals to people across the country, sided with the dog. Memes spread rapidly, mocking the HOA's obsession with control. Hashtags demanding change trended online. The neighborhood itself transformed under this wave of attention. Where once people lived quietly, isolated behind identical facades, now they gathered in driveways to laugh about the absurdity of it all. The dog's popularity brought neighbors together, and bonding over a shared realization that the rigid order of the HOA had stolen more joy than it had ever protected. Block parties emerged, community events sprang up, and the dog always took center stage, wagging his tail as though he were the host. The turning point arrived during one final HOA meeting when a record number of residents packed the room, their voices louder and more determined than ever. They were no longer afraid of fines or warnings. They had seen what collective attention could do, how a single wagging tail could dismantle a wall of intimidation. One by one, they demanded accountability, change, and above all, fairness. The board crumbled under the weight of that unified pressure. Members resigned, policies were amended, and the era of unchecked control began to fade. The president, once so fierce in her condemnation of the dog, was left isolated, her authority diminished, her voice drowned out by the very people she had tried to silence. As weeks passed, the frenzy began to settle into something calmer, more sustainable. The cameras eventually left, the headlines slowed, but the legacy remained. The neighborhood was not the same as before. It was freer, kinder, more connected, and at the heart of it all was a dog who had never known he was at the center of a storm, who had simply lived with joy until that joy became contagious. In the evenings, as the sun set over the rows of identical homes, the little dog would lie peacefully at the edge of the yard, head resting on his paws, tail twitching slightly. Neighbors passing by would smile, not because they saw a nuisance, but because they saw a reminder of resilience, of unity, and of how even the smallest spirit could inspire change. The HOA had set out to punish. Instead, they had accidentally built a legend. And so the story that began with a fine ended with freedom, not just for one family, not just for one dog, but for an entire community that remembered finally what it felt like to be neighbors instead of subjects. The dog had not just become famous, he had become unforgettable.